2 years ago, the name Arthur Fleck hit Gotham like a hurricane.
The trial of the century.
They believe Arthur Fleck to be some kind of martyr. Well, he's not. There's a monster.
All right, so we're diving into a pretty dark and twisted world today. And no, I'm not talking about my bank account after a weekend trip. We got a ton of you sending in reviews for Joker, Folie, deux.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's dying to know more than just if it's worth the price of popcorn.
Yeah, and by the looks of it, these critics can't seem to agree on much.
It's a real mixed bag of reactions, huh? Some folks singing its praises from the rooftops, others, well, let's just say they weren't as enthusiastic.
So not your average superhero flick, then?
Not even close. I mean, let's just get this out of the way right now. A Joker musical. Who saw that coming?
You know, I actually thought about that scene in the first one with the whole dancing to Gary Glitter.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, talk about foreshadowing, right? Like, we all knew Arthur had issues, but that scene, it was like a glimpse.
Yeah, like a whole other level of theatricality just waiting to explode.
Exactly. And that's where this whole foliado thing comes in. It's basically like shared psychosis, a delusion that spreads between people. So think about it. It sets the stage perfectly, not just for the plot, but for those musical numbers, too.
Oh, I see. So it's not just Arthur losing it, but he could be pulling someone else down with him.
Right. And who better than Harley Quinn to join him for this twisted little dance, right?
And with Lady Gaga in the role, talk about a power couple. Although, I have to say, the reviews on their chemistry are all over the place.
Yeah, The Independent called their dynamic like appealingly cruel, even feline.
Okay, I kind of get that there's a certain intensity.
Right. But then you've got RogerEbert.com, and they called the whole thing forced, even went as far as comparing Phoenix's performance to a caricature.
Wow. So what do you think is causing such a divide? Is it the acting or the way their relationship plays out?
It's probably a bit of both, right? I mean, these are two very troubled people, and they're drawn to each other's darkness. I think some people connect with that rawness, that need for validation, even if it's unhealthy.
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical love story, that's for sure. It's messy and complicated.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? It taps into the whole psychology of toxic relationships. It's that us against the world mentality, which can be seductive even when it's based on delusion.
It's like they're creating their own reality, and the music becomes a part of that, huh? And speaking of, can we talk about the soundtrack?
Yeah.
Going from classic show tunes to, like, 70s pop, even Sonny and Cher made the cut.
Yeah, it's a lot, right? Some critics called it genius, others, well, they weren't as kind.
So what's the deal? Is it there to entertain us, to make us squirm in our seats, or is it something more?
Well, one critic said it felt like a fever dream, like we're actually inside Arthur's head.
So not your typical musical where people burst into song for no reason.
Not at all. This feels more about using music to get at something psychological, you know, even if it means ditching the whole song and dance routine we're used to.
It's almost like the music itself becomes a character, reflecting Arthur's state of mind.
And potentially Harley's too, right?
Uh-huh.
Remember that shared delusion means their realities are merging, so the music could be a big part of that.
You know, that reminds me of the reviews that focused on the whole courtroom drama aspect. That question of whether Arthur is actually insane or just putting on a show.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and it comes up all the time in real-life cases, too, dealing with mental illness and the legal system. And it seems like the film really grapples with those complexities.
And I bet you've got some thoughts on how it handles all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But we should probably save that deep dive for part 2.
It really makes you think, you know, about those courtroom scenes and Arthur's supposed insanity. Can you even separate the man from the mask at this point?
Right. Like, is this still Arthur Fleck, or has he completely gone full Joker?
That's the question, isn't it? And some reviewers said Phoenix's acting is different this time around, like there's been a real shift.
Makes sense. I mean, he has done some pretty awful stuff in this one.
The Independent called his performance powerful, even stirring. They said you can't help but feel for him despite everything.
It's interesting, though, right? Because, I mean, he's a pretty terrible person. Is that just Phoenix being so good, or is there something about Arthur that makes you empathize, even now?
It's a good question, and I think that's what makes this character so interesting to people. Even RogerEbert.com, and they weren't sold on everything. They still said Phoenix is just magnetic in the role.
Though they did compare it to, like, a Daniel Day-Lewis impersonation. They thought it was missing that, you know, that awkwardness from the first film.
That's an interesting point. It's almost like Arthur, or Joker, I guess, he's transformed, right? He's not that same awkward guy anymore. He's bolder, more theatrical, like he's found his purpose, even if it's in being completely unhinged.
Maybe that's where Harley Quinn comes in. One review said Phoenix seemed more like, his character from Her when he was with Gaga, which is a weird thing to think about.
Because it's like, even with all the madness, Arthur still wants that connection, right?
Yeah.
Someone to really get him. And Harley, well, she's the perfect person for that in a messed up way.
It's like they validate each other's delusions. So Folie, deux, it's not just about shared madness. It's about finding someone who makes you feel understood, even when the rest of the world thinks you're nuts.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the whole social commentary angle in a new light. Because this time, it's less about a direct critique of society and more about, well, us.
Us? Wait, you mean the audience? How so?
So one critic compared the movie to watching, like, tabloid TV, saying that the focus on the trial, the media frenzy around Joker's crimes, it mirrors our own obsession with true crime, you know, turning tragedy into entertainment.
Oh, wow, yeah. It's like we're all kind of complicit in Joker's rise, even if we don't agree with what he does. Just by watching, being fascinated, are we feeding the very thing the film is critiquing?
It's a creepy thought, right? And it makes the social commentary way more effective because it points the finger back at us. We're not just watching these characters, we're forced to look at our own role in all of this.
It's definitely a much more unsettling approach than the first film, that's for sure. But it also makes Joker, Folie, deux, way harder to, figure out.
Totally. It's messy, it's full of contradictions, it keeps you guessing the whole time.
Just like Arthur himself.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, was this intentional? Is this chaotic, confusing experience all part of the plan?
That's the million-dollar question, and even the critics don't agree on that one, but honestly, maybe that's the point.
You're saying maybe it's not meant to be, easily understood or categorized.
Right. Maybe it's designed to stay with you, to make you think, to start conversations long after you've seen it. Which leads us to probably the most divisive part of the whole film.
You mean the music?
Right.
I mean, that's the thing everyone's talking about, whether it works or not.
Yeah, it's definitely the most talked about part. Even people who love the movie admit it's not exactly a feel-good musical.
Not even close. I mean, show tunes, 70s pop, Sonny and Cher. It's a lot to take in. What do you think they were going for with this weird mix?
Well, I read one review that said it's like a Spotify playlist gone rogue.
Okay, yeah, I get that. Unpredictable, kind of all over the place.
Yeah, exactly.
But does it actually work? Does it make the movie better, or is it just distracting?
That's the million-dollar question. The Independent loved it, called the musical numbers elaborate, and said Phoenix and Gaga had real chemistry.
I did think their energy was pretty undeniable.
Right.
But they also said the film doesn't always, distinguish between what's real and what's not.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's constantly blurring those lines, jumping between this really dark reality and these big musical numbers. It's almost like the film itself can't decide what it wants to be.
Which, actually, is kind of like Arthur's whole internal struggle. What if the music isn't supposed to be literal, but more a reflection of what's going on in his head?
A lot of critics thought the same thing. Instead of moving the plot forward, the music is more about showing us Arthur's mental state.
So less of a traditional musical, more like a psychological thriller with a killer soundtrack.
Exactly. And a super twisted one. And remember, it's not just Arthur's madness, it's shared. So those musical numbers, they could be showing us Harley's descent too, you know?
They're creating their own little world, and we're just along for the ride, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so effective. It's not simple. It doesn't give you easy answers. It stays with you, makes you think about the messed up parts of humanity.
So where do we even land on Joker, Folie, deux, after all this talk of musical madness and, the psychology of it all?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no easy answers with this film. It's not easily categorized, it stick with you, and it sparks a ton of debate.
Yeah, it's one of those movies that can be hard to watch 1 minute and then have you tapping your foot the next.
Exactly. It's a comic book film, but it's more about exploring the characters' minds than showing off superpowers. And that's what makes it so interesting, so memorable.
So if you're planning on seeing Joker, Folie, deux, get ready for something different.
Definitely. Go in with an open mind, expect the unexpected, and don't be afraid to let it mess with your head a little, because you're not going to forget this one anytime soon.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the madness for yourself, and we'll see you next time.
For more entertainment news, subscribe to The Hollywood Reposter.